Hello and welcome to the Good Life podcast with me, Sabine Pusch.
And me, Robert Keeling.
We are out and about for the first time on this podcast and have met with Tim White from the LSE in the beautiful Lincoln's Inn Fields on a gloriously sunny day. So thanks so much for meeting with us, Tim.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Rob, you came across an article by Tim, didn't you, in the newspaper, which is why we're here.
Well, it struck me that of all the things that really make for the good life, which is it's quite a broad philosophical concept, is where you live. Housing, mortgages, the rent always comes up in conversation. So, and I spotted Dr. White's really interesting article.
I'm a doctor.
You are a doctor according to the Germans, though.
Yeah.
If you have a PhD in Germany, you're a doctor. So, what got you interested in this subject?
So my research looks at how there's a financialization of housing, where housing has sort of increasingly become a funnel for investment. And this has happened in different ways in different places. Berlin is super interesting from a housing perspective because it's a majority renter city. Germany generally is, but particularly Berlin. And so it has a very different sort of housing politics to somewhere like the UK and London, which very much privileges owner occupation. One of the reasons that it's interesting is because it's a city of renters, it has a much stronger rights for tenants, and there's much more power generally given over to renters. But I was basically, for my research, following a series of sort of venture capital funded housing companies. And I realized that they were doing really quite well in Berlin. And I thought that was very odd, because you'd think that sort of capitalist housing enterprise wouldn't do very well in Berlin. So I sort of investigated why, and I found out that it was because of this loophole, which is sort of being exploited by a variety of landlords across Berlin.
Could you just explain to me what sort of rights German leaseholders have? Because, I mean, here you can just get chucked out with a month's notice, can't you, with a Section 21?
Yeah, absolutely. So most tenants in Germany have kind of long-term, highly regulated tenancies. I think the average tenancy in Berlin is something like 10 years. In the UK, I think it's more like 2. So they're very secure, and they are subject to rent controls, rent caps. So in Berlin, you can't increase the rent on a given property any more than 10% more than the average prices in the area. So there's this kind of rent cap, essentially, in Berlin. In contrast, in London, it's almost completely unregulated. There's no limit on how much a landlord can charge for a property. We have all sorts of crazy things that happen here as a result of that, like bidding wars, where kind of tenants are pitted against each other to sort of pitch their final rent and how much above asking price they're willing to put in. So you've got sort of like 20 or 30 tenants desperate for housing, sort of pushing, sort of this completely unregulated market that's causing it to really spiral. You've got things like no-fault evictions, where you can just evict someone for no reason. So in contrast to Berlin, we have a completely unregulated rental market.
Could you just explain to me what the loophole is?
Yeah, I realised I didn't explain at all about the loophole. So basically, the kind of Berlin rental market's quite heavily regulated, but there are a few exemptions in rent regulations and tenancy regulations. And the main one is if a apartment is rented as temporary, so it's rented out on a kind of 2 months plus basis, and if it's considered furnished, then landlords are able to evade the kind of existing rent caps and charge much higher rents. So what's happened is landlords and property owners and also real estate developers have kind of clued into this loophole and caused this kind of segment of the housing market to boom from, a relatively marginal sector of the housing market to now about 50% of listings across Berlin. And this means that because the rest of the rental market is regulated by this rent cap based on average local rents, it pushes those average local rents up considerably, inflating the whole market. Yeah, that's where we're at.
Sounds like we need a long German compound noun with effect written at the end. Is this a recognised? I mean, joking apart, is this a recognised phenomenon, or would you say you kind of spotted this?
No, I'm definitely not the first to spot this, and the Berlin tenant movements have been sort of pushing on this for ages.
So when I've been to Berlin, the first thing, if you live in London, that really hits you in the face is Berliners kind of showing off that their rent hadn't increased for a long time. It's been quite a surprise when this sort of much more raw, aggressive financial behaviour came in. So is this a new development that kind of snuck in that you spotted, or has it been like this for a while?
Yes. So I would definitely say that the loophole is a sort of a symptom of a manifestation of a broader power shift that's happened in Berlin. The key thing that happened was after unification, the city of Berlin was really, really struggling in many ways. Basically, one of the approaches it took to trying to kind of balance the books was selling off vast amounts of government-owned housing. So I think something like 300,000 public housing units were sold, often in vast blocks, to mostly American asset managers. They'd sell off like a block of 60,000 apartments, and I think every apartment would have been about an average of kind of 7,500 euros at the time of sale in 2006, I think this was. So that just gives you a sense, you can't buy many apartments in Berlin for 7,500 euros now. So there's just been this huge kind of corporate and financial capture of what was previously publicly owned housing in Berlin. And that has many consequences. One of them is, of course, that it's a transfer to the private sector, so it's not subject to the same regulations. The other problem is that the kind of real estate lobby in Berlin has become much stronger. So yeah, it's reshaped the balance between landlords and tenants, that privatisation.
Of course, London is owned mostly by big families. I mean, the whole of Mayfair is famously owned by the Duke of Westminster, and whose worth, I believe, having looked it up, about £10 billion. And the rest of lots of central London is owned by the Crown or other lordly families that go back hundreds of years. Is that the case in Berlin? And if not, why not?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly the breakdowns of ownership of land, but it's certainly not the same level of kind of concentrated wealth as in the UK. In the UK, there's, as you say, a massive ownership of the church, the Crown, also quite a lot of sovereign wealth funds. The ownership of the land itself has always been much more kind of monopolised in the UK.
Is it almost feudal?
It's almost feudal, but then a bit like what happened in Berlin, but also different. When Margaret Thatcher sort of went on a mass kind of privatisation of everything spree, she also privatised loads of land and public assets. Basically, from the 80s, there was this massive sell-off of public land and housing and infrastructure. A similar thing, I think, happened in Berlin as it did in London, but rather than selling off kind of these huge blocks of public housing to investors directly, we had right to buy, which is where sitting social housing tenants could buy their social housing unit. So it was privatisation through a different means. It still ultimately takes the ownership of housing out of public hands and into private hands. So I think in the UK now, something like 40% of units purchased under right to buy are rented out on the private market. So it's sort of had the same effect ultimately, but through different means.
I was trying to get a better sense of what this feels like in Berlin, and you've written the loophole that you've identified and studied is prevalent in neighbourhoods such as Charlottenburg-Wilmersdorf, which is in the west of the city, Neukölln, which is kind of quite trendy, but in the southeast, Pankow, which I'm guessing includes Prenzlauer Berg, which has always remained trendy, I think, and I'm sure always will be. For people who know Berlin, these are really different neighbourhoods. Is there Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting, kind of looking back in Berlin's history, is how you had these neighborhoods like Friedrichstein and Kreuzberg that were right in the center of Berlin, but they were up against Berlin Wall. And so they were some of the poorest parts of Berlin and some of the cheapest places to live, very undesirable places. When the wall came down, they suddenly found themselves kind of in the middle of the city. So somewhere like Kreuzberg has seen such an insane transformation over the last kind of 30 years, where it's become, it's bang in the center of Berlin all of a sudden. So that's massively changed the demographics, and loads of gentrification. It's almost a cliche to say that Kreuzberg is very gentrified now.
And then areas in the west, so Charlottenburg, Wilmersdorf is, for the most part, fairly affluent, and I guess always has been. It's been in a very desirable part of West Berlin. This loophole for furnished flats is being exploited as ruthlessly as it is in the places you just mentioned, by the sounds of it.
It's true. No, it's very interesting how it's being exploited. You wouldn't necessarily think that Charlottenburg would be because it's quite it's very like German, sort of classical part of Berlin, but yeah, interestingly it is. I mean, I should say that I think Charlottenburg has or is on the verge of pushing legislation now, which clamps down as much as possible on this loophole. And so I think actually, even though it doesn't have quite enough powers to really get rid of the problem, it can kind of introduce licenses and things to basically clamp down on it to some extent. But yeah, it's a pretty widespread problem in Berlin, this loophole. I think it basically speaks to the power of the real estate industry now in Berlin, that basically they keep having their motions to clamp down on it overturned. The real estate industry is really good at making themselves seem like the solution rather than the problem, and they're quite convincing to government, who's desperate to provide you new housing to increase supply. So the real estate lobby will say, this is more supply, and any supply is good supply, but that's not how it works with housing. It doesn't work like other commodity types. And in fact, what's important about housing supply is how much it costs and where it is. So it's not a case of any supply is good supply with housing.
Actually, I wanted to ask you, we are here in Lincoln's Inn Fields, which I'm old enough to remember being a sea of tents of homeless people back in the 90s. And I was wondering if there's been a homelessness effect in Berlin. I mean, here I looked it up before we met. Shelter says that 1 in every 48 people in London is homeless. And I just wondered if there is a similar effect happening in Berlin.
Yes, I don't know the numbers, but I know it's massively increasing. And it will, because housing is way more unaffordable. It's a direct symptom. Although my understanding is that in Berlin there are better provisions for homeless accommodation and things like that. The overall increase in cost of housing inevitably does cause more homelessness,
And what other pressure does it have on the society there? What have you seen generally in wider society in the arts and culture of Berlin?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. Just before I wrote this piece in The Guardian, there were a slew of kind of articles in like the Financial Times and The Guardian too, saying it's kind of the end of Berlin. It's sort of time as poor but sexy is over. It's just turned into a city just like London or New York that's unaffordable to live in. There's no longer that kind of space for creativity and kind of alternative ways of living. And I think that's absolutely true. In order for a thriving kind of creative and cultural scene, there needs to be space for people to breathe. And when you're spending, half of your income on rent, you don't have that space.
An expression I've heard from a few Berlin friends was, it's really time for Berlin to wear big boys' trousers or something like that. We can't pretend, if we're going to be a world city, a Weltstadt, we've got to really up our game. And whether that means sort of hyper gentrification, which I guess sounds like you're describing, a certain, this is an inevitable growth pang of a city. And that's an interesting point of view, right? It's a bit provocative maybe, but the way that in the longer term, for a city hall which has slashed its arts budget by about a third, which is pretty full on, Is this just another rupture in the growth of an already fairly big city to become an even bigger city? Or is there a kind of gentler way to do that, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's an appealing narrative, and it's a narrative that works well for people who are doing well out of the situation in Berlin. But of course, there are loads of other ways that you can grow without causing devastation. One of them is properly supporting an affordable housing system through different means. Gentrification is in no way inevitable, and I think it's a bit of a distraction from the things that the government could do and the actions of the private market, I would argue, to say that this is kind of an inevitable and organic part of the process.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the first area in London that was known to be an artistic and alternative centre was, I believe, Chelsea.
Yeah.
And then followed by Notting Hill. It kind of went round the city. And so much of what makes a city attractive, surely, is that sort of artistic world. And certainly it's true of Berlin, isn't it? I mean, I certainly feel that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, my parents lived in Notting Hill in the 70s and 80s when it was very much a hub for punks and artists.
Like Berlin.
A bit like Berlin, yeah. But it is certainly true that when you look down some streets in Berlin now, it does look a bit like some parts of London. It looks a bit like some parts of kind of other more kind of commercialized cities. It's still, I think, got so much going for it. But you do start to see a kind of convergence with other really expensive global cities. And I think one kind of common misconception is that this is the fault of expats. This is the fault I mean, don't get me wrong. Whenever I hear loads of British accents when I'm in Berlin, I'm a bit like, ugh. But it's not their fault. These are political decisions. They're political economic decisions. The government could be doing more to provide affordable housing, and it's simply not the fault of individuals that it's become like that.
I would say that is the biggest difference I feel when I go to kind of trendy bits of Berlin or try to go to trendy bits of London, is that in Berlin it feels quite stark. So people not grappling with German too well, and locals in Berlin I found pretty cross about that. And whereas in London, it sort of, my sense, it gets lost in the noise a little bit because there are so many languages here. Few people fight that English should have a primacy over other languages here. Whereas in some of the neighbourhoods you've mentioned, I'm thinking like Neukölln, in particular, Prenzlauer Berg is a classic one. It makes Berliners really cross. For obvious reasons, Germans and Berliners struggle, I think, even now with all the big changes in Germany recently, to find the vocabulary, literally sometimes, to express frustration that foreigners don't adapt to life in Germany. And that occasionally builds up in people as well. Just turning inevitably to a bit of politics, is this something that the Alternative for Germany party have their sights on in Berlin and are sort of willing, presumably, to exploit a little bit?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. I mean, my understanding of the rise of support for AfD is less kind of white Western expats and has some quite explicitly racist undertones. I think that's been their focus, and like most kind of right-wing populist parties have mobilized the housing crisis as a way of saying that immigrants are the problem. But I wouldn't say it's so much the kind of like the Londoners there to enjoy the nightlife that they've really mobilized around.
I'm just imagining that all these Berliners are really, really angry with the British people crossing the road on a red light.
I know. Honestly, I find it. It just takes me so long to get used to crossing the road, to waiting for the light. It's terrible. But I'm just like, what are you all doing? But yeah, no. Overall, I really approve of it.
Although a lot of Berliners seem to pride themselves on being the Germans that don't care about the red and green light thing, so they're always trying to be a bit different, I guess. I have a thought which sort of slightly shamelessly brings us round to the previous podcast, which was around citizen assemblies and citizen engagement. You mentioned Charlottenburg. Am I right in thinking there's been a move to hold a kind of mini referendum? And are there ways to democratically engage with people that stop the decisions being taken out of their hands, would you say?
Yes, I think that it's not my area of expertise, but I know that certainly there's a kind of growing interest in like participatory planning and local plans and citizen engagement in London too. And I think all of those things are really great, but the key thing is, where the power lies, and ultimately they can only do so much if they don't have legislative power. In Berlin, I think the local authorities do have some power. In London, they're really powerless. So decisions made at the kind of local level can only be relatively superficial. So I think it's great to have citizen engagement as long as it's backed by sufficient power.
Yeah, thank you. This is I think we've covered huge amounts of ground. It's really interesting, and thanks so much for your time and the Crow as well that was also contributing to this conversation. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. It's given me quite a fresh view of kind of history, I suppose, in a way, of Berlin and some of the challenges, and hopefully Berlin will retain its kind of rich but sexy, or not so poor but sexy. I'm not trying to coin a slogan there, honest. Kind of keep its edge in the future.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one thing that's really clear to me is, compared to somewhere like London, everything is much more contested, housing being a big one. These kind of recent moves to expropriate hundreds of thousands of apartments from corporate landlords, freeze rents. There's a lot more kind of widespread resistance to the changes that we're seeing, and there are a lot more legislative resources for, I'd say, ordinary people to use. So I have hope that, if anywhere is able to push back against these forces, it's Berlin.
Do you think London could learn from that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it could. I just think that we, as a society, we're not as well set up for the resistance of ordinary people. So yeah, that's what I'd say about that.
Thank you.